meeting. Okay, I don't know if you heard that. I usually hear it from my end, recording in
I did.
progress. Okay, so you
I
were
was
thinking about the Greek alphabet.
Yes, because the question is like the Greek alphabet of the 18th century BC was a revolutionary invention that brought about a large number of social, legal, technical, literary, and philosophical changes to Asian Athenians. What were some of those changes? How were they interrelated with one another? How did the Greek alphabet help bring about both democracy and philosophy? I
Hmm.
was thinking like the invention of the Greek alphabet brought about the change of the letter being the written word, and because of the written word, it helped philosophy and democracy because they're able to have pre-descendants that are recorded, and therefore should a similar to generation in the future, they have an idea of what was done in the past, and based on that decision,
Yeah.
it came with the idea of a backing of similar sentence. To this day, this idea has been passed down due to how, for example, like in the courts, if there is like a criminal trial, they will usually see if there is a similar sentencing in order to make the recommendations of the jury based upon that.
Hmm.
It also helped because a lot of the ideas prior to that relied a lot on word of mouth, and word of mouth is really unreliable because if someone were to forget the teachings, they will get lost over time. Furthermore, if the person doesn't have enough time to change it, like the generations could be lost of learning.
Hmm.
It helped philosophers out a great deal because philosophy is a cycle in itself. Like one day, like you will never be about the same one. Like it will be like if you were to look at the cycles, it would be one person takes an idea and then the other person goes to the past to find the opposite idea of what it was doing in order to progress the thought of schools. Everyone goes in the direction of contradicting the other, just purely because it is a matter of debate and a lot of physical views. Like you have seen the cycles you've seen, for example, like one generation probably
Hmm.
talk about like what the goods of communism, and the other one will go over to the past and talk about why it's not good. And based upon that, they'll keep building each other up. And it is very crucial because a lot of ancient societies had a lot of the original philosophers of those thoughts, like Socrates. And because of that, it provides a unique insight of what could have been done in similar situations. A good example of how this could come into practice with like the Socrates writings, like you take a look at how they did a lot of rhetorics, and those tactics are still used to this day. By analyzing the concept of rhetorics, one could learn that often in times the best philosophy is not to outright provide the answers to the questions, but rather make the person think through the questions than to answer that in such a way that they lead their own conclusion. And it provides a great deal of insight into the field of democracy because by people being able to make up their own conclusions, they're free to, without any undue influence, to make the correct decision based upon what they would have made otherwise. They're just merely planting there the thoughts of the thought process. And rather than outright stating, and therefore it occurs to the idea of philosophy because I follow at the end of the day, it's all about free thought, and democracy is
Hmm.
being upheld by the individuals due to how the conclusions are made on their own. Another great way that the our Greek alphabet made a lot of changes were because a lot of the Greek plays and strategies, even though they're like really ancient, could still be like applied to this day. For example, fear from the gods, a retribution of doing a crime, could have
Hmm.
been the basis of a module of the future criminal code, because a lot of those stories provide very stern punishments, and and that kept the fear of into man of what it could have been happening, and therefore kept the criminals in check, which later on that fear transpired into what the law could have done. It's all the evolution of
Hmm.
progress as it was, led the evolution from myth to pure logic.
Yeah. Now, the most important thing here, there's two things. One, with the written alphabet, not only can you write down thoughts, as you point out, but now you can start thinking about thoughts, which allows language to become much more abstract. Prior to that, you have mythology uh, telling stories about events, natural events, whether it's crazy weather or whether it's maybe some state of affairs in the world, and the the texts that were used to explain what was going on needed to rhyme. They needed to fit within a certain iambic pentameter, all that kind of English stuff. So what happens with the written language is the form of the epic poem is now no longer necessary. What they're doing is taking the time to think about the right word And I wish right now I could show you the old Greek dictionary that I used to have, which was almost 3 inches thick. So what I mean by that is when it came time to pick the right word, not one that rhymed or not one that fit into the, the meter of that sentence, but in fact, the right word to describe logos, right? Or discourse, dialectic, metaphysics. Those things, those ideas couldn't even be described because there was no visual representation. There was no example that someone said, well, it's like a tree or it's like a sun, it's like a dog. No, to talk about dialectics, you need to explain it. And all of a sudden, what if you had to do it within the confines of a poem, right? An epic poem. So it completely shatters this model that had been used now for thousands of years because it was an oral culture. Now we have a written language, which the Greeks had up until the 1200s. And then the Dark Ages set in, and it was literally the Dark Ages. Nothing was left behind, including individuals who remembered how to write. So this whole dark period, which lasted about 400 years, is a complete mystery. No one really knows what happened, except that Greece and all of its city-states lost everything. Economic collapse and cultural collapse, the works. So you have these people thinking about thoughts. You have individuals more and more curious about the world. And suddenly along comes this remarkable invention that allows them to kind of hit the ground running, right? Because they're already thinking this way. Now, suddenly, the written word, the written language allows them to pick the most precise term to describe something. And sure enough, what happens is people start to think about metaphysics, about laws and structures that lie beyond and behind the natural world. To try to describe that in iambic pentameter and in epic poetry, that'd be pretty tough. But now with the written language, you can be absolutely precise in your thought. And of course, along comes Homer, Hesiod, writing works and days. The pantheon of the gods now can be explained in more detail. And that's not to say that the gods and goddesses disappear. They're just set aside. Mythology is set aside as an explanatory model, and then language takes over. And of course, at the same time, you have people that are teaching rhetoric, right? And rhetoric is the way to argue persuasively. So we have this brand new invention that allows people to think about thoughts and formulate thoughts about things, think metaphysically, think abstractly. But you also then have individuals that can see how language, I'm not going to say the word manipulate, but persuade, we'll say, allows people to persuade others that their idea is the best, whether it's Plato, whether it's Protagoras, whether it's Socrates, it doesn't matter who it is, but each of them are arguing their case. And what the sophists are doing is teaching individuals how to use language in the most persuasive and compelling way. Ultimately, what ends up happening if you believe Plato is sophists simply wanted to win the argument for the sake of winning. So it wasn't whether the argument was sound or right, it was whether or not you can win an argument. And that really was the wrong way to go. And also explains why Plato was not a big fan of the sophists either, because he thought that skill, that gift, right, of persuasive power should be used for good, right? Should be used for elevation and enlightenment. And he just saw the sophists as individuals who were manipulative, right? But all of that was not possible until there was language. And not only was Plato not a fan of the sophists, he also was not a big fan of the written language either. He thought that it would basically cripple memory, and we would simply refer to something rather than experiencing it. And of course, this is the guy who isn't a big fan of the material world either. And yet he's very ambivalent feelings towards the written language and writes all of his works, 1,800 pages worth, all of his works in the form of a dialogue. So the thing that is lost in the written language, which is direct contact and communication between two or more people, Plato sort of compensates by writing these dialogues where each individual has their say, But eventually, each person now has to concede a little bit, and you end up with something called truth by consensus. And the way in which Plato sets up his stories, his dialogues, is that way. So there's all this sort of thinking and rethinking and reformulating. What about this? What about that? What do you mean by, truth and justice and so on? But eventually, Plato uses the written word to basically kind of write a screenplay. Because if you read through his stories, they're essentially screenplays, right? They're dialogues between people. So he's trying to get the best of both worlds, right? He wants to be able to use the written language to write down his thoughts so people can go back and read them and reflect. But he also, because he misses the immediate contact of direct communication, writes in that form, right? Writes in the form of a dialogue. So that's kind of one of the main reasons why the written language is so important. So you've got the sophist in the agora, right? Talking to other politically minded people, persuading each other that a particular law is good or bad. And with the written language too, you have for the first time the beginnings of a legal system that is humanly ordained, right? Humanly created rather than a gift from the gods. Because by the time 400 BC rolls around, there are so many things occurring in Athens and in the city-state that there are no stories in mythology to explain what is going on. The stories end up sort of more and more distant from the immediate concerns of the polis, economics, warfare, community standards, ethics. These are all these different topics that now kind of are brought to the table and are discussed and written down and reflected upon, and of course, more discussing. So to your point that it is a series of contradictions, maybe not so much contradictions as a kind of call and response, right? Someone makes a statement, someone defends it or opposes it. But again, all of this is done with the mindset that others can read it as well, because the more people you persuade, the more likely you are to have your argument, win the day. So whether it's politics or law or philosophy, that written language is a gift, for better or worse, that allows people to persuade one another, because now you can think about the exact perfect statement, phrase, word, that is going to bring your point across. So that kind of, in a nutshell, is one of the reasons why it is really important. And I'm glad that we recorded it because now you can go back and sort of listen through to it. But those are kind of the ideas that I was looking for, and the ideas that I kind of present in those slides. Does that help you in any way?
Yeah, I think I got an idea. So you want me to basically make a paragraph, like a structure of a paragraph style kind of way. I'll do like my
Mhm.
introduction, then basically refer to like a writer, a few writers, and talk about what they build their views upon it, then do a reflection of those views, kind of like that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Now, depending on how in depth you want to go, if you want to just focus on just philosophy, then I would set aside the law and politics part and just focus on that. And certainly within that perimeter, you can talk about the sophists because they too were philosophers. But if you want to look at it that way, how did it impact philosophy specifically? That will give you kind of a template from which to work. But yeah, like an introduction, conclusion. Um, this one is that's the shorter of the two essays, or am I confusing it? It's just two.
We're doing the one that says number one, and it says this is a research essay, so 50% of your mark will be a reflection of your sources.
Okay, all right. So that one, that particular one, if you're aiming for like 1,000 words, which is usually about 4 pages, keep that in mind because you want your introduction to be fairly brief to kind of again set out the framework, and just basically state something to the effect that prior to the guess is between 750 to 800 BC. And the only reason why that is because Homer is able to write the Iliad and the Odyssey right around 750. So it would have been immediately before that. So around 750 BC is when this new written alphabet, which was partly based on the Hebrew alphabet, the Semitic alphabetic system. It's compromise of that, and again, a real shorthand, like just these little squiggles on on the ground or on a papyrus sheet and say, okay, this means this, or this may mean an entire word. But once that's established, then these thinkers, like I say, literally hit the ground running. They're already in this inquisitive state. And this is following probably at least 100 years, if not more, of traveling through to different cultures, trade routes that are becoming reestablished because prior to 1200, those all fell apart. So there's now a kind of reinvestment into trade, which allows people to, visit various cultures that are quite unlike their own. And of course, all of a sudden over there we see, oh, okay, so there's a Hebrew alphabet, there's an Egyptian alphabet, an Assyrian alphabet. We've got to get something new, right? So they come back and they come up with some shorthand version. So the key here, though, is that it allows philosophy to really bloom in a very, very short time, because prior to that, the only way to remember something was through memory, right? Being an oral culture. So the switch from an oral, I should say, to a written culture is a fundamental one, because now laws can be written down on the side of a building. Here are the new laws that we've enacted. The individuals that live in that city state, can go to the agora and look and go, oh, okay, this is what was decided for this week. Now, depending on who the person was, because there were slaves, in Athens, some may not have been able to read Greek, but probably they learned it pretty quickly just by default. But yeah, having the written language allowed more people to know what was going on, because it wasn't a matter of having to recite to people going door to door, but simply posting this information and people going there to have a look at it. And that's over and above all the papyrus sheets that Plato and Aristotle and all the pre-sophists, or the pre-Socratics, were busy writing down. Many of them are lost, and a lot of the pre-Socratic thinkers, their information is only coming from secondhand sources, commentary by Plato and Aristotle and others. But again, we know at that point they were already writing things down. So if you want to keep it contained, I would focus probably just on philosophy, and then maybe, just a footnote somewhere. This, of course, is to say that, this written language was applicable to the creation of laws and the creation of democratic systems, right? Democratic in quotations, of course. You can just put that by way of in the conclusion or in a footnote, just draw attention to it. But if you keep it focused on philosophy and this idea that philosophers now could think about thoughts, right? That was probably the key. No longer worried about describing what they see in front of them, but what they imagine to be behind it. So imagine trying to explain to someone, without using a diagram or, extrapolating something, going, well, here's what I mean by natural laws, right? Here's what I mean by, metaphysical dimensions to things. That's really hard to grasp unless you can read it and think about it. And no big surprise, right? Once that written language is there, one of the first fields in philosophy is metaphysics. So prior to that, it was simply the natural philosophers looking at the world. But the moment they were able to use this brand new tool, the first thing they start doing is thinking about nature, thinking about humanity. And that's where not having to write in a poetic fashion with, the meter and the rhyming scheme. Once that's gone, it makes writing down ideas so much easier. Hopefully that's helped. If that's kind of given you an idea of how
Yeah,
to.
it has. That was, yeah, it was. I will. Okay. Okay. Now we can stop the recording, I guess, for now. Like, if we need to, we can restart it later.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shut it off.